I don't usually notice other hikers for very long. You pass, swap a nod, maybe a joke about the weather, and then the trees fold you back into your own rhythm. That's the best part of hiking alone: your pace, your thoughts, your noise. I first saw him on the climb up to Birch Pass, a steady grade with switchbacks that feel carved by people who hated switchbacks. He was maybe 50 yards ahead when I rounded a corner, gray cap, olive jacket, dark pants, moving with that metronome step of someone who knows exactly how much energy to spend. I watched him for a minute because it's weird to inherit a pace. His steps became my steps, and then I looked down to watch my feet and forgot about him. At the next bend, he was gone. The trail slanted across a talus slope and skimmed the edge of a stunted spruce stand. And by the time I reached the spruce, I had that odd sense you get when a song cuts off mid-sentence. No other side trails, no resting rock. Vanished over the next ridge, I told myself. Happens all the time when speeds don't match. I made the pass just before noon. The wind tasted like iron. I ate a crushed tortilla with peanut butter balanced on my knee and felt that private satisfaction of being nobody important in a big place. When I started the descent, I saw the gray cap again far below, bobbing along the next traverse like a little boat. Day 1, that was the whole story. Day 2 started with frost on the tent. I was taking the long route toward Pine Meadow, a string of sites along a glacial bowl that usually fills with weekenders. But this was midweek, and the parking lot had only 3 vehicles. My plan was simple: 8 miles, early camp, dry socks, lake water boiling to pretend I know how to make coffee. The trail curved through ferns and out along a low ridge. Just after the ridge, I saw him again. Same jacket, same cap. He was farther ahead now, and I only knew it was the same guy because of the way he moved, hips barely twisting, hands hanging loose, never touching the straps of his pack like the rest of us do when we think no one's looking. I glanced at my watch, more out of curiosity than anything, and watched his back for a while like people watch flames. When I stopped to take a picture of a mossy log that looked like a crocodile, he stopped too, or maybe I just lost sight of him. Either way, I hiked alone for the next hour. I reached a small creek crossing around 1, the water low enough to hop. Mud on both banks preserved a day of stories. Deer, raccoon, the wide circular print of dog, and boots, a single set heading my way, large tread with a squared heel. I measure mine beside it. Same pattern, different size. Not unusual, but something about the crisp edges told me those prints were newer than mine should be. I looked up. The trail ran straight for 50 yards before curling out of sight. Nothing moved. I told myself the prints could be from earlier hikers, packed hard by cold air. At Pine Meadow, the wind laid down against the lake and the quiet felt heavy. I claimed a site on the far end and hung my food bag from a blackened limb. Only one other tent sat by the shore, a low green dome with a fly pulled tight. No lights, no voices. The register box at the trail junction had 2 names scribbled that morning. Mine and someone with a scribble I couldn't read. Maybe the gray caps. Maybe not. I cooked dinner wearing my hat, which always makes me feel like a child playing at camping. A jay scolded a squirrel to my right. Water tapped the shore. Nothing dramatic. When it got dark, I went to the lake to wash my pot and saw a light blink once across the water. Not a headlamp sweep, not a steady glow. Just one tiny pulse there and gone. I counted 60 hoping to see it again and didn't. I slept fine until the dream where you think you're falling and jump yourself awake. When my eyes opened, I was already on my side, staring at the tent wall. It was the kind of night where the cold pushes your awareness against the fabric and every sound distorts. I listened. The lake shuffled. A branch ticked against another branch. Then I heard it, the specific, deliberate creak of weight on clothes by duff. A single step, pause, a second step, Another pause, like someone remembering how to move quietly. Your body has old rules it drags up without asking. Mine said be still. I lay with my mouth closed around my breath and stared at a little crescent of moonlit mesh near the door. No silhouette cut the light. The steps circled toward the back of the tent and stopped. There was the faintest sound, zipper teeth being pinched and slid. Only an inch, the sound it makes when you test if the pull still works. Not my zipper, somewhere 3/10 down, but I was at the far end of the meadow. Unless the green dome was closer than it looked. I whispered, hello, because that felt like something you do when you want to believe this is nothing. Nothing answered. The steps receded, soft, almost polite. I told myself it was a deer. The zipper sound was wind. The fear was the leftover static of a bad dream. Then I dozed like a stone and woke to pale light. What you do in the morning sets the story you tell yourself about the night. I made coffee. I joked out loud to no one about Mr. Deer and his excellent zippers. When I went to pull my food bag, there were 2 sets of footprints under the tree. Mine from last night and a second set superimposed, the larger tread with the squared heel. They walked in from the trail, stopped directly under the limb, turned, and walked back the way they came. No milling around, no confusion. In, out. I stood with the rope in my hands for a long time, some part of me still bargaining with coincidence. Lots of people have that tread. The path under the limb is obvious. The beach fire rings are full of random tracks. I hauled the bag down, ate 2 packets of oatmeal, and told myself I'd probably pass Gray Cap today and get a normal explanation out of him. Something like, oh, that's your sight? Sorry, friend. I was looking for the bear hang. Great night, wasn't it? He was ahead of me again by mid-morning, sometimes a smudge of movement between trees, sometimes just a flick of olive that could have been lichen. Once, where the trail straightened into a sunlit corridor, he glanced back. Not long, not enough to catch his face, just the chin turning a degree, the sense of an eye checking the rear view. I hate being paced. It's like having a song stuck in your head you didn't choose. I sped up. He sped up. I slowed to retie my boot. He slowed at roughly the same moment to adjust something in his pack. I started to feel the way you do when you realize you've been humming out loud in a quiet room. At noon, the trail split. Left toward a waterfall overlook, right toward a long, skinny ridge with a campsite at the end. This is where the body asks, which way matters less? Which way feels empty? I took the ridge, partly because the map showed steep drop-offs on both sides, and I figured fewer people would choose it. If one of the falls, good. If he followed me, I'd have my answer. The ridge is a strange place. Trees up there grow like they've been told to behave, thin, straight, evenly spaced. The ground is a quilt of pine needles and rock. I hiked quick, telling myself the increase in heart rate was from a grade. On my left, the valley cupped the world. On my right, a branch of river flashed between trunks. I didn't look back until I reached the high point. He was closer, not close enough to catch details, close enough to know he had shortened the distance. I stepped off the trail and sat on a boulder as if I had meant to do that all along, took out my water bottle, pretended to check the map. He hesitated 20 yards down, then passed me without a word. His face had that scrubbed, dehydrated look you get after too much altitude and not enough salt. If he'd looked up, we would have met eyes. He didn't. The olive jacket zipped to the base of the throat, gray cap blotched with sweat, pack slim, like a day pack padded with clothes. He smelled faintly, cleaner than a person that far from the trailhead should. Hey, I said, because it felt worse not to say anything. He nodded without really nodding and kept moving, that same metronome pace, like he was trying to keep time with a song I wasn't hearing. Okay, I thought, that's that. He's just a guy. I drank water. I watched him shrink down the path. I counted to 60, then 10 more, then shouldered my pack and followed. The ridge ended in a small rocky knob, with a campsite clung like it had been regretfully granted space. There was no one there. No gray cap. No tracks I could trust in the mat of needles. The only sign of human activity was a ring of stones and an old length of cord tied to a branch at I don't know what height, too low for food, too high for laundry. I dropped my pack and walked past the site to where the ridge pinched down to a goat path and stopped. Below, the slope tumbled into trees. No trail, no switchback. He could not have gone that way unless he enjoyed falling. The other option was the way I'd come. I turned and looked back along the ridge. It was empty. This is the part of the story where you expect me to say, I found a note or a strange piece of gear or a smell that made no sense. I didn't find anything. The air smelled like sun on bark. The wind ticked the undersides of needles. I walked the site 3 times, then sat on a rock where I could see the approach from both sides and ate lunch in small bites because my stomach had tightened. He didn't come back up. No one did. I should have set my tent there and spent the afternoon convincing myself the world is ordinary. Instead, I packed my trash, took a last look at the cord in the tree, and headed back along the ridge toward the main trail. Halfway along, I saw prints in a patch where rain had hardened soil, then shade had kept it from turning to dust. Big tread, squared heel, heading toward me, as if he had come back this way while I was sitting on that rock staring the other direction. Maybe he'd passed when the wind was up and I was tearing open a stubborn wrapper. Maybe I was not as attentive as I wanted to believe. I camped early in a creek hollow with thick undergrowth that felt like walls. I hung my food low and close, not because of bears, but because I wanted it near. Evening leaned in quick. A jay returned to scold me personally. I made the smallest fire allowed, mostly for the sound. When it was dark enough, I turned off my headlamp and sat there until the dark felt like a thing I was wearing, not a thing moving toward me. At some point, the creek swallowed my thoughts, and I slept. When I woke, it was to the idea of footsteps, not the sound. The way your brain sometimes hears a thing before your ears do. I lay there and told myself to wait for a second sound before naming the first. The second sound never came. I drifted. Around 3, I had the sudden, childish certainty that someone was standing just outside the tent, absolutely still, but I knew that was what fear does. It draws silhouettes with whatever tools are near. Morning broke like a clean habit. I pulled the stakes with quick hands and was tying the final strap on my pack when I noticed the prints, one set right outside where my door had been. Not an animal's soft crescents. Boots. The edges weathered by the night air, but new. The toes pointed not toward the trail, but sideways, as if the person had stood there, listening. The tread matched the square heel I'd been playing down. Beside the second print was a small oval pressed into the soil, as if a knee had touched down, then lifted. I've told this part a dozen ways in my head. One version is dramatic. I ran. The true version is duller. I walked out. I stopped at every bend to listen. I checked behind me, so often I made myself dizzy. At the first junction, I saw a ranger stapled notice about blowdowns and mud and felt briefly insulted that the world was still using paper for small problems while my head had a larger one. I reached the trailhead just before noon. The lot held the same 3 vehicles and a 4th I hadn't seen before, a dark sedan with a sun-faded bumper. I would love to tell you the gray cap was visible under the glass, or that the olive jacket hung from the passenger seat. The interior was empty, neat, aggressively anonymous. On the drive home, every car behind me felt like it had chosen to be there. I'm not proud of that, but I also don't think paranoia is always a mistake. Sometimes it's a memory of what your senses already noticed. I kept my pack in the living room that night. I didn't unpack it for a week. When I finally did, I turned each item in my hands like I might find fingerprints hiding along the edges. There weren't any, of course. There was nothing, just the small, domestic mess of a trip completed. dirty spoon, map stained with coffee, coil of cord I didn't remember tying. A month later, I went back to Birch Pass with a friend. We made the climb slower. We talked more than the forest deserved. No gray caps, no olive jackets, only a pair of students taking selfies by the cairn and arguing about whether the wind counted as ambience on video. On the way down, we passed a section of trail with fresh mud, and I caught myself looking for the squared heel. It wasn't there. The world was normal again, as if that had been the temporary condition. Here's the part one don't have a clever ending for. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe the same thing I wanted, to move through a place without anyone asking anything. Maybe he was afraid of me too. Maybe he had a reason to check my tree, a reason to stand outside my tent measuring the distance between my breathing and the door. What I do now is simple. I camp where I can see approaches. I don't pretend to sound as wind if my stomach calls it a zipper. I sign registers with only my first initial. And sometimes, when I come to a ridge with thin, straight trees and a path that plays tricks with time, I let someone pass and sit on a rock a while and watch the blank space they leave behind, trying to learn its shape. It was Jess's idea to take the back route to the ridge overlook. We'd both had a week of emails, meetings, and the kind of city noise that clogs your head. So the plan was simple. Drive into the mountains, find a quiet spot to park, camp for a night, and watch the sunrise from a cliff no one else bothers with. We left late in the afternoon. The road was narrow, patched in places, dirt in others, with switchbacks so sharp you could see your own taillights if you craned your neck. The only sign we passed after the ranger station was a weathered one that read, "No winter maintenance. Travel at your own risk." When we finally reached the overlook, the sky was melting into gold behind the peaks. The lot was just a wide gravel loop with space for maybe 5 vehicles. Empty, except for us. The cliff edge dropped into a valley of dark spruce, and beyond that, a string of ridges fading into blue. We parked near the far edge, killed the engine, and let the quiet settle. There was no hum of traffic, no distant barking dogs, just wind in the pines and the occasional ping of cooling metal from the hood. We set up camp about 30 yards from the car, just far enough to feel like we were out there, but close enough that if the weather turned, we could pack up quick. By the time the tent was staked and the fire going, the first stars had begun to push through the deepening blue. That's when the headlights came. From a tree-lined curve where the road entered the lot, 2 beams cut across the dark, sweeping over the cliff edge, over our car, and finally landing on us. The vehicle rolled forward slowly, the engine low and steady, until it emerged fully into the gravel loop. A white cargo van. It pulled into the space directly opposite our site and stopped. The headlights stayed on, washing over the trees behind us. Through the glare, I could just make out the driver's silhouette, a shape in the seat, unmoving. Jess murmured, "Weird place to stop." I said nothing. My first thought was maintenance or survey work, but there were no logos, no side windows, no ladder racks, just blank white metal that reflected the firelight in dull patches. Minutes passed. The van didn't move. The headlights didn't dim. Finally, I raised a hand and gave a half wave toward the cab. The kind you give to say, "Yeah, we see you, it's fine." No reaction. Jess leaned closer. "You think they're watching us?" I didn't answer that either. We let the fire burn down to coals, waiting to see if the van would leave. It didn't. The longer it stayed, the less I wanted to break camp in full view of those headlights. Around 10, Jess crawled into the tent, muttering about just ignoring it. I stayed out a little longer, telling myself the fire needed tending, but really just listening. Engine still idling, a faint rhythmic click like a turn signal that wasn't engaged, wind tugging at the tarp over our gear. Sometime after 11, the engine cut off. The headlights went dark. My eyes struggled with the sudden blackness. The world collapsed into silhouettes. I could hear gravel crunching under tires as the van rolled forward a few feet and stopped. That was enough for me. I zipped the tent and lay there beside Jess, pretending to sleep while my ears strained for every shift outside. At some point, exhaustion won, and when I opened my eyes again, pale light was pushing at the tent walls. I unzipped the door quietly and looked toward the lot. The van was still there. Same spot. Jess woke as I was making coffee. "Still here?" she asked, glancing toward it. "Yeah." We ate in silence, both pretending to focus on the view. By mid-morning, we decided to pack up. As I was stuffing the last of the tent poles into their sack, Jess stopped and frowned at the gravel between our site and the lot. "Were those there yesterday?" she asked. The prints were faint, but visible in the damp gravel. A set of boot tracks leading from the lot toward our camp. They stopped about 10 feet from where our fire had been and turned back. I tried to brush it off. Could be from us moving gear around. She shook her head. Not our tread. We loaded the car quickly. As I turned the ignition, I glanced at the van. The windows were dark. Too dark. Either tinted far beyond legal limits or covered from the inside. Pulling out, I had to drive past it. My eyes flicked toward the driver's seat as we passed. Empty. We didn't talk much on the way down, but the further we got from the ridge, the more I expected to see the van in the mirror. It didn't follow. By mid-afternoon, we decided on another campsite, a small pull-off near a stream several miles from the main road. It wasn't an official site, but it was quiet and out of the way. We set up again, cooked an early meal, and were starting to relax when I heard it. The low hum of an engine approaching. Jess froze, spatula in hand. The van emerged from a curve. Same blank white panels. Same slow roll. It eased to a stop just past our car and sat there, engine running. Jess whispered, "That's not a coincidence." We didn't wait for it to move. We shoved what we could in the back of the car and left the rest. 2 camp chairs, a half-full water jug, a frying pan cooling on a rock. I took the road toward the highway, keeping my eyes on the mirror. The van followed for half a mile, then turned off onto a dirt spur and vanished into the trees. We didn't stop until we hit a gas station in the next town. Jess ran inside for snacks while I fueled up. Then when I saw it again, parked at the far end of the lot, nose facing the pumps. I left the tank half full, jumped in, and pulled around to the front of the store. Jess came out carrying a bag, saw my face, and dropped it in her lap without asking. We drove to the ranger station. The desk officer listened, nodded, and took down our description. When I mentioned the boot prints, he leaned back in his chair. "You're not the first to mention something like this," he said. "White van, no plates, hanging around overlooks and pull-offs. We've sent patrols, but so far, nothing we can pin on them." He advised us to stick to busier areas, and if we saw it again, to call immediately. We didn't camp that night. Took a cheap motel instead, one with a parking lot lit like a stadium. In the morning, our chairs and frying pan were gone from the streamside site. Weeks later, Jess sent me a link to a local forum. Someone had posted about a white van parked outside their rural cabin for hours at a time. No one inside when they checked, but new tire tracks appearing each night. The replies were full of similar stories. Hunters, hikers, people on road trips. We never got an answer to who was driving it or why they followed us. But now, whenever I see a white cargo van on a back road, my hands tighten on the wheel and I check the mirror more than I need to. Because maybe it's nothing, or maybe it's waiting for the next quiet overlook. I met him halfway up the ridge trail. The day had started out warm for early spring, but the higher I climbed, the more the wind clawed through the trees, sharp enough to make me zip my jacket all the way to my chin. I'd been moving at a steady pace for hours when I heard footsteps behind me, fast, deliberate. I turned just as he came around a bend. Mid-30s maybe, clean-shaven, wiry build, an easy smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. He carried a pack that looked smaller than mine, not nearly enough for a multi-day trip. Mind if I walk with you for a bit? He asked. I hesitated. Normally I like hiking alone, but there was no polite way to refuse without feeling like a jerk. Sure, I said. He fell in beside me, introducing himself only by first name. He asked the usual trail questions, where I was headed, how many nights I'd be out. I kept my answers vague, something I've learned from years of solo hiking. We stopped at a small clearing to rest. I dropped my pack, pulled out my water filter, and refilled my bottle from a stream trickling through the rocks. He didn't seem to have his own filter, just drank from a single bottle he'd been carrying. You're going light, I commented. Yeah, he said, smiling. Don't like carrying more than I have to. I usually just borrow what I need from other hikers. Makes things simpler. I thought he was joking. By late afternoon, we reached a designated campsite, a flat patch near the river, ringed with tall pines. I had planned to camp alone, but he rolled out a sleeping pad about 20 feet from my tent. I told myself it was fine. I'd be gone early in the morning. That night, I cooked noodles on my small stove while he watched, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He didn't cook, just asked for a taste of mine. I gave him a small portion out of politeness, even though I hadn't packed extra. We talked a little, but something about him made my shoulders tense. His questions had shifted. What brand of tent was mine? How much did my headlamp weigh? Did I carry a spare filter cartridge? The wind picked up after dark, rattling the fly of my tent. I slept lightly, waking at every crack of a branch or shift of the fabric. Sometime around midnight, I heard faint zipper sounds outside. Not the heavy metallic zip of my tent door, but softer like the pouch on my pack. I unzipped the tent quickly, but by the time I poked my head out, the clearing was silent. His sleeping bag was zipped to his chin. He didn't move. In the morning, I noticed my headlamp was missing from the side pocket of my pack. I keep it there out of habit, so I can grab it quickly. I checked everywhere, tent, cooking kit, pockets, but it was gone. You seen a headlamp lying around? I asked him, keeping my voice casual. He shrugged. No. I told myself I could get by without it for a few days. We hiked out together again, though I tried to keep some distance between us. The trail climbed steeply along the side of the ridge before dropping into a dense stand of spruce. The trees closed in overhead, dimming the light. Around midday, we stopped to rest. He pulled out a headlamp from his pack to check the battery. My headlamp. Same brand, same scuff on the plastic casing from when I dropped it last summer. That's mine, I said flatly. He looked at me for a long second, then smiled. Nah, I've had this for months. Must be the same model. I knew it wasn't. The scuff mark was too distinct. But standing there, miles from anyone, I felt the weight of the situation. I could push it, or I could let it slide and avoid turning things into a confrontation I couldn't walk away from quickly. I let it go. We reached another campsite that evening. I pitched my tent quickly and kept my gear inside. I even put my boots in the vestibule, something I normally don't bother with. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of my food bag rustling. My tent door was still zipped, but when I unzipped the vestibule, the bag was gone. I shoved my feet into my boots, grabbed my jacket, and stepped out. He was sitting by the dying embers of the fire, my food bag beside him, sorting through the contents. What are you doing? I demanded. He looked up like I'd caught him doing something harmless. Just seeing what you had. Thought I might trade you for some of it tomorrow. That's not how it works, I said. I picked up the bag and carried it back to my tent, my heart hammering. I barely slept after that. Every sound outside felt like a step. At first light, I packed in record time. He was still lying in his bag when I left. I didn't say goodbye. I hiked hard, putting as much distance between us as I could. By early afternoon, I reached a ranger station at the edge of the forest. I told the ranger what had happened, not just about my gear, but his habit of borrowing from other hikers. The ranger's expression tightened. You're not the first person to mention him, he said. We've had a few reports over the past year. He's careful, never takes enough to get in real trouble, but enough to make people uncomfortable. He wrote down my statement, thanked me, and said they'd keep an eye out. A week later, I went through my gear at home and realized something else was missing: my backup water filter cartridge. I hadn't even noticed at the time. I thought back to his smile, the way he'd said he borrowed what he needed. And I wondered how many other hikers had stories just like mine, walking away from a trip with a little less than they started with, and no proof except the gut feeling that they'd been played. Now, I keep everything inside my tent at night. I cook far from where I sleep. And when someone on the trail asks to walk with me, I trust my first instinct before I trust their smile. I was 3 days into a week-long loop through a national forest that doesn't see much traffic outside hunting season. It was early May, too late for snow, but too early for the summer crowds, and I'd gone almost 2 full days without seeing another person. That afternoon, the trail wound down through a ravine thick with cedar and hemlock. The air felt heavier down there, damp and cool, the kind that makes every sound carry farther than you expect. I was moving slowly, half from a steep grade and half because the forest seemed to invite silence. That's when I saw the first sign. Just off the trail, tucked between 2 leaning cedars, was a ring of stones blackened with soot. The ashes inside were fresh, not warm when I touched them, but still clumped together like they hadn't been there more than a day or 2. There was no campsite marked on my map anywhere near here. Curiosity pulled me a few steps farther in. Behind the fire ring was a tarp strung low between trees, the kind of quick shelter you'd throw together if you didn't want to be noticed from the trail. Underneath it, a rolled sleeping bag, a dented metal cup, and a half-empty bottle of water. Everything was there except the person. I called out, just a simple hello, and waited. The forest gave nothing back but the muted rush of the stream somewhere below. My first thought was maybe a hunter or a prospector had set up here temporarily, but it felt odd to leave camp like that. No food bag hung, no gear stashed against rain, nothing packed. Just abandoned mid-use. The trail bent away from the ravine and climbed into drier ground. I walked another mile before I stopped for the night, picking a spot well off the trail where the trees were thin enough to give me sight lines in every direction. I was halfway through dinner when I caught it, a single deliberate snap of a twig from somewhere beyond the light of my stove. It wasn't the random pop of cooling wood or the scuttle of a squirrel. It was heavier. Hey, I called, my voice louder than I meant. Someone out there? Silence. I waited, scanning the dark between the trunks. Eventually, I heard another sound, not footsteps exactly, but the soft hiss of pine needles shifting under weight. Slow, measured, circling. I stayed sitting, trying to look casual while my heart pounded. Whoever was never came close enough for me to see. After a few minutes, the sound faded toward the trail. Sleep didn't come easy. Every gust of wind against the tent sounded like someone brushing the fabric. I woke more than once convinced I'd heard breathing just outside. In the morning, the ground told me enough. Around the backside of my tent, the pine needles were compressed into distinct prints, boot tread, large size, fresh. They came in from the trail, stopped near the tent, and went back the same way. I broke camp fast, moving earlier than I usually would. My plan was to put as much distance as possible between me and whoever had been walking around my site. By mid-afternoon, the trail took me over a ridge and down into another valley. As I rounded a bend, my stomach sank. Another unmarked camp. This one was different. No tarp this time, just a small nylon tent tucked behind a thicket, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. The tent was zipped, but I could see through the mesh roof that there was nothing inside but a sleeping pad. A few feet away, a small fire pit was still ringed with unburned twigs, as if someone had stopped mid-build. Next to it, a pile of scavenged branches and a mug half filled with water so cloudy it had a film on top. Again, no person, no pack, no jacket hung over a branch. I didn't linger. Whatever this was, I didn't want to be there when they came back. That night, I camped even farther off the trail on a rocky outcrop with a steep drop on one side. It felt more defensible somehow, though I told myself I was being paranoid. The wind picked up after midnight, and I let the sound mask my nerves. I must have drifted into a light sleep, because the next thing I remember was waking to a faint crunch of gravel somewhere below the outcrop. I sat up, straining to listen. There was again slow steps climbing the slope. Whoever it was, they were moving carefully, like they didn't want to be heard. The sound stopped before reaching the top. Then came something worse, silence thick enough to feel. I knew whoever was down there was standing still, maybe listening for me, maybe looking. After what felt like an hour, but was probably a minute, the steps retreated, down the slope, back into the dark. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in my bag with my headlamp in one hand and my knife in the other until the first hint of dawn. When I finally crawled out of the tent, the only sign that anyone had been there was a faint scuff mark in the loose dirt at the edge of the outcrop. It could have been made by an animal, or it could have been someone turning to leave. I hiked hard that day, cutting my planned route short to aim for the trailhead. The sun was low when I passed through one last grove of old pines. There, in the shadows between two massive trunks, was another fire ring, stones blackened with soot, a bit of ash scattered by the wind. No tarp this time, no tent, just a single boot print in the soft earth beside it. Same tread as before. I didn't stop to study it. I didn't stop at all until I reached the road and saw my car sitting where I left it. When I pulled away, I checked the mirror more than the road ahead. I still don't know who was camping out there, or why they left their sites half-finished and empty. I only know that twice I felt someone circling me in the dark, and once I saw where they'd been watching. And now, whenever I see an unmarked camp in the wilderness, I give it a wide berth. Some people don't want to be found, and some people don't want you to leave. The lake was the kind you only find after miles of gravel road and a half-forgotten trailhead, long, narrow, framed in dark spruce and granite. I'd picked it because it was out of the way, too far for casual day trippers, and perfect for a weekend of fishing and quiet. I put in late in the morning, paddling my small aluminum canoe along the shore. The water was glassy, the kind that mirrors clouds so perfectly you can't tell where the sky ends. I'd been out maybe half an hour when I saw him. At the far end of the lake, a canoe sat low in the water, angled just enough that I could see the silhouette of a man in the stern. A fishing rod rested across the gunnels, and the bow pointed toward the bank like he was drifting. I figured he was just another fisherman, so I raised a hand in a lazy wave. Too far for him to hear me, but close enough for him to see the motion. He didn't wave back. I kept fishing, glancing now and then to see if he'd moved. An hour passed. His canoe was in the same spot, though the light had shifted and the water should have pushed him along. By noon, I decided to head back toward the small cove where I'd left my gear on shore. As I turned, I noticed the man's canoe was gone. I scanned the lake, but didn't see him. No wake, no sound of a paddle. I told myself he'd just pulled up to shore somewhere I couldn't see. Back at my site, I set up camp, tent near the tree line, a small fire pit by the water. I cooked lunch, drank from my filter bottle, and let the warmth of the day lull me into that pleasant in-between state where you're not quite asleep, but far from alert. That's when I heard it. The faint dip splash of a paddle somewhere behind me, muffled by distance, but steady. I stood and scanned the lake. The canoe was back. It drifted slowly along the far shore, parallel to my camp. This time, there was no fishing rod across the gunnels. The man sat in the same position, but his hands rested in his lap. The paddle trailed in the water beside him, barely moving. It wasn't the way people fish. It wasn't the way people travel. It was the way you move when you're in no hurry, but you don't want to stop watching. I told myself I was imagining it, that he was probably just enjoying the view from that side of the lake. But I stayed on shore until the canoe slipped behind a rocky point and out of sight. By late afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing. I fished for my canoe until the sun dipped low, then headed back to camp. As I pulled my boat onto the bank, I glanced toward the far shore again. Empty. I cooked dinner, let the fire burn down to embers, and zipped myself into the tent. The night was quiet except for the occasional pop of a log shifting in the fire pit. Sometime after midnight, I woke. I couldn't say why. The fire had gone cold, but the moon was bright enough to silver the ripples on the lake. And there, in the center of the water, was the canoe. No paddle moved, no wake trail behind it. It sat so still it could have been painted there. I froze, watching from the shadow of the tent. The man was just a dark shape in the stern. I couldn't see his face, but I felt the weight of his attention like a cold hand on the back of my neck. After what might have been minutes or hours, the canoe drifted backward into shadow until it vanished completely. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I lay with my boots beside my bag, ready to move if I had to. At first light, I was on the water. The surface was calm, no sign anyone else had been there. I paddled a slow loop around the lake, checking every inlet and cove. No canoe, no man, no tracks along the muddy banks. By afternoon, the wind picked up. I decided to pack up rather than spend another night. As I loaded my gear into the canoe, I glanced down the lake one last time. The white flash of a paddle blade broke the surface, just for a second, from behind the same rocky point where I'd lost sight of him before. I didn't wait to see more. I pushed off hard and paddled for the trailhead, the wind at my back. I didn't stop until I was on shore, hauling the canoe onto the rack and strapping it down like I could trap the whole weekend there with it. Driving out on the gravel road, I caught glimpses of the lake through the trees. The water looked empty, but I kept expecting to see a dark shape sliding between shadows. I don't know if he was following me or if I just happened to notice him too many times. I only know that the sound of a single paddle breaking still water has a way of staying in your head long after you've left the shore. The forest road into the valley had been open when I drove in that morning. I'd passed through the old green gate without thinking much about it. Just a faded sign bolted to one post warning about seasonal closures and hunting dates. It was early fall, dry and cool, the leaves just starting to yellow, and I had the place almost entirely to myself. The plan was a simple day hike, up the ridge to a viewpoint, loop down along the creek, and back to the car by late afternoon. 8 miles, give or take. The trail was everything I wanted it to be, quiet, shaded, full of the kind of earthy smell you only get under a thick canopy. I didn't see another person the entire way to the viewpoint. I lingered there for lunch, looking out at the valley below, a long ribbon of green and gold winding between mountains. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, the shadows were stretching long and the air had a sharpness that hinted at the coming evening. I followed the short gravel spur back to where the road met the gate. That's when my stomach dropped. The gate was shut. A thick new chain looped through the bars and around the post, secured with a heavy silver padlock. The paint on the lock was still bright, no dust or rust. I stood there for a long minute, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen a ranger truck, hadn't heard anyone drive past. There had been no closure notices of the trailhead. The road had been opened and unlocked this morning. Of that, I was certain. I tried the lock. Solid. I walked along the fence line in both directions, hoping to find a low spot or a gap. The forest on either side was thick, and the slope dropped off steeply just beyond the road. My car sat on the other side of the gate, about 30 yards down the road, looking frustratingly close. I pulled out my phone, thinking I'd call the ranger station. No signal. I walked up the road a bit, then down, holding the phone in the air. Still nothing. That was when I noticed the scuff marks on the dirt near the gate post. Fresh boot prints, big tread, mixed with the shallow lines of something being dragged. The drag marks led from the road into the trees. I told myself it was probably just a hunter moving game or a maintenance worker shifting tools. But the hair on the back of my neck was already prickling. The light was fading fast. I didn't like the idea of being stuck out here overnight without planning for it. I ran through my options. I could wait and hope someone came back to unlock the gate, or I could try to bushwhack around the fence and get to my car. The slope on the right side looked marginally less steep, so I followed it down, pushing through the brush until I reached a section where the fence was just wire strung between posts. It would still be a squeeze, but I could probably get through. I ducked and stepped, one leg over, then the other, the wire groaning faintly as I twisted through. When I straightened, I was on the roadside of the fence. My car was only a short walk away. I glanced back once before heading toward it. That's when I saw movement in the trees, just a flicker maybe 30 yards in, like someone shifting their weight behind a trunk. I froze, staring into the green-brown tangle. The forest was still again. No wind, no bird song. I didn't wait to see more. I walked quickly to the car, trying not to break into a run. My keys were in my jacket pocket, and I had them in my hand before I even reached the driver's side. Sliding into the seat, I locked the doors automatically. The gravel crunched under my tires as I turned around to face the gate. Up close, I could see the padlock again, gleaming faintly in the low light. It hadn't been there this morning, no question. Someone had come in, locked the gate, and left. I drove up to it anyway, leaning out the window to check the chain. Solid as before. Beyond it, the road curved out of sight. For a moment, I thought about just waiting in the car until morning. But the idea of sitting here in the dark, knowing there was someone else out here, maybe watching from the trees. No, the slope to the left of the gate dropped sharply for 20 feet before leveling out. If I was careful, I could ease the car down and around the post, then back up onto the road. It wasn't a great plan, but it was a plan. I backed up, lined up the angle, and inched forward, tires sliding in the loose dirt as I made the descent. The undercarriage scraped once as I climbed back up to the road, but then I was through. I didn't look back. When I finally hit pavement, I pulled over to get a signal and call the ranger station. The dispatcher on duty sounded surprised. "Gate was open this morning," she said. "We didn't send anyone out to close it." I told her about the chain and the fresh lock, and about the movement I'd seen in the trees. She was quiet for a moment before saying, "You did the right thing leaving. We'll send someone to check it out." I never heard if they found anything. But for weeks after, I kept replaying that image in my mind. Those fresh boot prints, the scrape marks, and the faint, almost human shift of something in the shadows as I looked back through the fence. Now, whenever I pass a gate on the way into the backcountry, I make sure it's still open in more than just the literal sense. And I always check for a second way out. The trail into the basin was one I knew well. 10 miles of switchbacks through pine and spruce, dropping into a wide, meadowed valley surrounded by ridges. It was a place I camped in before, a favorite because it was far enough from the road to keep out the casual crowd, but easy enough to reach in a long day. I left late that morning, figuring I'd make camp near the stream at the valley floor, fish for a bit, and head out in 2 days. The hike was uneventful. A couple of deer, one grouse that exploded from the underbrush and almost made me drop my pack. Nothing unusual. By the time I reached the meadow, the sun was low enough that the ridges had begun to throw shadows across the grass. I found a dry, flat spot near the water, pitched my tent, and got a fire going. It was quiet. That kind of deep woods quiet where the loudest sound is the pop of sap in your fire. I was sitting there, stirring the coals, when I noticed a faint orange glow through the trees to the east, maybe a quarter-mile away, up on the lower slope of the ridge. At first, I thought it was the sun catching some rock face, or maybe a camp far enough off that I couldn't hear it. But the color shifted and flickered, not steady like a lantern or headlamp. It looked like fire. I stood for a minute, watching. The glow didn't move. It pulsed slightly, as if someone were tending it. There were no marked campsites in that direction. No trail I knew of. I thought about going over, but it was late, and bushwhacking through unfamiliar ground in the dark isn't smart. I told myself it was probably hunters or another backpacker who preferred more cover. I banked my fire low, crawled into my tent, and let the sound of the stream carry me towards sleep. Sometime later, how much I couldn't say, I woke to the smell of smoke. Not from my fire that had burned down to nothing. This was fresher, sharper, the kind you get when someone's just thrown green wood onto a flame. I unzipped the tent and looked toward the ridge. The glow was still there, a little brighter now, flickering between the trunks. Something about it unsettled me. There's a difference between the casual comfort of your own campfire and the distant, silent burn of someone else's. I watched for a while, hoping to see the silhouette of a person move across it, but nothing did. Eventually, I zipped the tent and tried to sleep. In the morning, there was no sign of smoke. I packed a small day bag and headed east, using landmarks to keep my bearings. It took me about 20 minutes to reach the slope where I thought the fire had been. There was no campsite, no ash, no burnwood. Instead, I found a circle of log arranged like seats around a bare patch of earth. The ground inside the circle was littered with leaves and pine needles, undisturbed. No sign of anything having burned there in months. It felt wrong somehow, like walking into a room where someone had just left. Except here, it was clear no one had been for a long time. I didn't linger. Back at my camp, the day passed normally. I fished the stream, made lunch, read for a while. By late afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself the glow had been a trick of light, maybe moonrise behind a ridge. But when darkness came, so did the fire. Same place, same steady flicker. This time, I kept my own fire going brighter than usual, the way you might keep a porch light on when you're feeling exposed. I ate quickly, cleaned up, and sat watching the glow until the chill drove me into my sleeping bag. I woke once in the night, thinking I'd heard footsteps in the grass. I listened for a long time, but heard nothing else. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed early, doused the coals, and started up the switchbacks out of the basin. Halfway up, I looked back. From that height, I could see my old campsite clearly. And beyond it, in the trees on the east slope, I thought I saw a faint smear of gray rising through the canopy. It could have been mist. It could have been smoke. I didn't go back to find out. I've been in that valley a dozen times since, but never again have I seen a fire in those trees. And yet, every time I camp there, I find myself glancing east after dark, half expecting to see that flicker come to life again, painting the trunks in a light that never seems to belong. I was 3 days into a solo drive through the mountains, the kind where you measure distance in hours instead of miles. The forest roads were narrow, barely maintained, and I could go an hour without seeing another vehicle. Late in the morning, after a long, winding stretch, I spotted someone walking along the gravel shoulder. A man, maybe mid-40s, wearing a weather jacket and a faded baseball cap. He had no pack, no water bottle, no visible gear, just his hands in his pockets and a slow, steady pace. As I got closer, he stepped slightly off the road and gave a short wave. I slowed, more out of instinct than decision. "Trailhead's a ways up?" I asked, leaning across the passenger seat. "Yeah," he said, voice flat but clear. Headed that way myself. Mind giving me a lift? Something about him seemed ordinary, not threatening. I unlocked the door, and he climbed in. We made small talk as I drove. He said he was meeting a friend at the trailhead to hike in for a few days. When I asked if he needed to stop for supplies, he shook his head. It's not far, he said. I know a shortcut once we get there. The trailhead was exactly where I expected it to be, a wide gravel lot with a faded map board and 2 other cars. I pulled in, thinking I'd drop him off and continue on my way. But he didn't open the door. You're headed north, right? He asked. I nodded cautiously. Mind taking me a little further? The shortcut's up that way. Saves a couple hours walking. I hesitated. It was still early and the road was quiet. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We drove another 20 minutes, the road narrowing as it climbed. Eventually, he pointed to a dirt spur road on the right. Here, the turnoff was little more than 2 ruts through tall grass. I slowed, glanced at him. It's fine, he said. Goes through to the trail. I've walked it plenty of times. I eased onto the spur. The trees closed in, branches brushing the sides of the car. After a quarter mile, the track dipped into a small clearing. Here's good, he said suddenly. I stopped. He got out without another word, closed the door gently, and started walking toward the far side of the clearing, away from the direction we'd come. I watched him go until he disappeared into the trees. When I turned the car around, I noticed something. There was no sign of a path where he'd enter the forest. No worn trail, no cut branches, nothing but undergrowth. The drive back to the main road felt longer than it should have. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see him standing there, watching. 2 hours later, after winding down the other side of the range, I came around a curve and nearly slammed on the brakes. There he was, walking toward me along the shoulder. Same jacket, same cap, same slow, steady pace. I drove past without stopping this time, my hands tied on the wheel. In the mirror, he didn't turn to look at me. He just kept walking like the first ride had never happened at all. The trail wound along the edge of the ridge, a narrow cut through wind-stunted pines and sun-bleached grass. I'd been out since sunrise, climbing steadily toward a small alpine lake I'd marked on my map weeks before. It was early autumn, cool air, sharp light, and I hadn't seen another hiker all morning. About a mile from the lake, the trees opened onto a rocky overlook. That's where I saw him. He was standing off to one side, looking down the slope toward the valley. Expensive hiking clothes, technical jacket, brand-name boots that looked barely broken in, but no backpack. Not even a water bottle in his hand. I gave a nod as I passed. Morning. He smiled faintly. Morning. His eyes followed me as I moved back onto the trail. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see another hiker, but it was him. Same unhurried pace, hands in his jacket pockets. Headed to the lake? He asked. Yeah, I said. Couple more miles, I think. He nodded. You camping out there? The question felt casual, but something about the way he asked made me answer vaguely. Just out for the day. He matched my pace for the next stretch, asking small questions, what trail I'd taken in, whether I'd seen any wildlife, how often I hiked alone. His voice was even, but there was a strange focus in his eyes, like he was weighing my answers. At the next bend, I slowed to retie my boot. He stopped too, watching as I knelt. Most people would step ahead, give you space. He didn't. I waved him on. Go ahead, I'll catch up. He smiled again. I don't mind waiting. When I finally stood, he fell in beside me again. The lake came into view about 20 minutes later, a sheet of blue ringed by golden grass and dark pines. I stopped at the shore, setting my pack down on a flat rock. He wandered a few paces away, staring out over the water. Still no pack, no sign of food or gear. You not carrying anything? I asked. Travel light, he said. Don't like being weighed down. I didn't press. After a while, I moved a short distance along the shore to filter water from the inlet stream. When I came back, he was standing near my pack, looking down at it. "Lost something?" I asked. He stepped back quickly. "Just checking the stitching on your bag. Looks sturdy." I stuffed the filter away and decided it was time to head out. He didn't argue, falling in a step behind me as we retraced the trail. For the first half mile, I could hear him just a few steps back, boots on rock, the occasional scuff of gravel. Then the sound faded. I glanced over my shoulder. The trail behind me was empty. I picked up the pace, not liking how the hair on my arms was standing up. By the time I reached the ridge overlook again, the sun was low and shadows were pooling under the trees. That's when I heard it, a branch snapping somewhere off the trail to my left. I stopped. The forest went still. Then another snap, closer this time. I didn't wait. I started down the trail at a steady, deliberate walk, resisting the urge to run. Every so often, I thought I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of dark fabric between the trees. But when I looked, there was nothing. By the time I reached the trailhead, my shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool air. My car was the only one in the gravel lot. I tossed my pack in the back and climbed in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. As I pulled out, I checked the mirror. There, at the far edge of the lot, just beyond the tree lean, stood a figure in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, watching. No pack, no movement, just watching as I drove away. It was the last leg of a 3-day loop, and I was moving faster than usual, eager to get back to the car before the predicted rain rolled in. The trail dropped steeply through fir and cedar before spilling me onto an old wooden bridge spanning a deep ravine. The bridge was one of those relics you find in the backcountry. Planks worn smooth, railings weathered to gray, the nails sunk deep into the wood with rust blooming around them. The drop beneath was at least 40 feet, the bottom lost in a tangle of rocks and brush. Halfway across, I noticed him. A man stood at the far end, leaning casually against the railing. Mid-50s maybe, wiry build, a sun-faded ball cap pulled low. He wasn't wearing a pack, and his hands were tucked into the pockets of a windbreaker that hung loose around his frame. I slowed instinctively. Encounters out here were rare, and usually you could spot another hiker by the gear they carried. He didn't have so much as a water bottle. "Afternoon," I called as I approached. He nodded but didn't speak. His eyes followed me as I crossed, but he stayed where he was, one shoulder against the railing, like he'd been standing there a long time. I passed him with a polite nod, the boards creaking under my boots. He smelled faintly of campfire smoke, though I hadn't seen or smelled any fires on the trail so far. Once I was across, I glanced back. He was still leaning in the same spot, watching me. The trail curved into the trees, and I lost sight of him. I walked another mile before stopping for water, shaking off the encounter. Just another oddball out for a walk, I told myself. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened and the light was fading faster than I liked. I was less than 2 miles from the trailhead when the path swung back toward the ravine, and there was the bridge again. From this approach, I could see all the way across to the other side, and my stomach tightened. He was there, same spot, same posture, leaning against the railing as if he'd never moved. The only way that made sense was if he'd taken the trail I was on in reverse, cutting miles off with some side path I didn't know about. But I hadn't passed him. I hadn't heard anyone behind me. I slowed as I stepped onto the bridge. The air felt heavier here, the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own breathing too loudly. Up close, I could see that his clothes were clean, too clean for someone who'd been hiking all day. The laces on his boots were bright white. "You headed back toward the lot?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the space between us. He just looked at me, a faint smile on his face that didn't touch his eyes. I walked past, keeping my gaze forward. The boards groaned under each step. When I reached the far end, I allowed myself a glance back. He was still leaning there, still smiling faintly. I didn't stop again until I reached the trailhead. My car was the only vehicle in the gravel lot. I tossed my pack inside, started the engine, and pulled onto the road. As the trees thinned, I caught one last glimpse of the ravine through the passenger side window. The bridge was visible in the gap. He was still there. Same spot, same posture, watching,